Welcome to the ArcFlash podcast, sparking new ideas in the data center sector. I'm Kevin Aboden.
And I'm Jabez and we're here to provide a balanced, nuanced, and hopefully unbiased view on the state and most pressing topics affecting the data center and hyperscale cloud industry. We all want to see our industry succeed, but we're also not naive cheerleaders nor doomsayers. What we ultimately believe is the best way forward is by addressing and being transparent with the challenges and sharing key themes and trends that are unfolding in the sector. I've been covering this space for over 12 years now as a research analyst in the data center space and lead the practice here at Structured Research. And today, Kevin, we've got an interesting one in the lineup, which is both of us are going to talk through what's going on with Nvidia and their latest earnings.
And boy, were they awesome, weren't they? I mean, we thought last quarter was amazing. This quarter just blew last quarter out of the water even. And you have a bunch of points lined up here that you wanted to look through, right?
Yeah, and I want to just say that we're just going to talk through the key themes and trends. We're not here to feed you numbers and growth rates. I mean, that's like low-hanging fruit that you guys can just Google and ask ChatGPT for. But we're here to provide something insightful and add some commentary around what are some of the key trends that are coming out of this earnings call. And the number one thing that stood out to me, Kevin, is that Jensen Huang specifically said that they estimate that in the past year, roughly 40% of their data center revenue was for AI inference. Now, is that shocking to you? Because I thought that training was going to be a lot more than 60%.
Well, that is kind of shocking, and that's starting to tell me one of two things. One is that inference is actually happening, right? And we always assume that inference is years off, that we're all training models still, that we're not there yet, it's not actually in production. Well, apparently things are in production, aren't they? And if things are going to be in production, they're going to be more in production coming up, if you follow, right? Like there's going to be more usage of these models to recoup some of that development expense. Other thing that could be happening is maybe there's some training and inference in the same place. I'm starting to hear whispers of that maybe some companies are trying to do the same thing in the same place, and that's saving on some of the expenses too. So it's getting a little murky as to what's going on where.
Yeah, and I think people often think of training as this like linear monolithic segment, but within training, there's, like you mentioned, there's different nuances just within training itself. There's like training that can be done in a remote location, just cheap power, cheap land, and you just build these 30,000 GPU clusters. But there's also a lot of applications that need to be constantly retrained in real time. And that, like you mentioned, has to sit proximate to these AI inference nodes. So there's, a proximity sensitive location to inference, but there's also certain types of training that is also, location agnostic, right?
Absolutely. And I think we're going to start to see an interesting, I don't know if it's divergence in that it's a change from what we thought it was, or maybe it's a convergence of both of these things happening a lot of the same places. So that's going to be interesting in coming months and coming quarters, really.
Yeah, I mean, another data point to switch gears is that they sort of confirm. I mean, this is not a new data point, but they said that the large CSPs or the hyperscalers represented more than half of their data center revenue, supporting both internal workloads and external public cloud customers. So not a huge surprise there. I think it's fairly consistent with what they've reported over the quarter, but they did call out specifically about the growth coming from Microsoft's GitHub Copilot. They used Meta as an example in terms of AI enabling more accurate predictions, improve advertiser engagement, which translates ultimately into more revenue for these large hyperscale companies.
So it's interesting, right? Because there's two companies you just mentioned that have been working with Nvidia very closely. They're now talking about developing their own GPUs, right? We've seen press on that in recent days where Microsoft might be working with Intel. Meta's doing their own thing. So how is that going to shake things up? I mean, I can't imagine anyone walking away from Nvidia per se. I mean, their products are just too good and too usable, and there's so much more coming as far as usability that it's probably got to be an and thing, right? It's not going to be an or thing.
Yeah.
It's going to be well, we couldn't get as many DGXs as we wanted this month, so we have our own reserve of our own chips that we're going to add on here, and we'll work with both.
Yeah, and you touch on a very sensitive issue here, which is this sort of tension between the hyperscalers and NVIDIA, because the hyperscalers are in some ways threatened by the potential of Nvidia to really disrupt them in the AI as a service space, but then they also are really dependent on Nvidia's GPUs to power the next generation of technology and capabilities for their public cloud platforms. And so and I feel like you've listened to the earnings already, because there was a really important question that was asked to Jensen Huang during the call, which is, how do you make sure that you allocate these GPUs fairly across the ecosystem? Because it's been said that Nvidia doesn't want to just sell all their GPUs to the hyperscalers. They want to seed a more fragmented ecosystem where there's more diversity, and hence the rise of these GPU clouds. But yeah, I know. Before I tell you Jensen Huang's answer, what is your initial gut feel when I make that statement?
Well, I think there's something to be said for bulk buying, right? And I think this goes for anything in the data center industry. There were a lot of supply chain difficulties for all supplies, right? Everything that goes into a data center 3 or 4 years ago. Well, then vendors started to expand their supply chains because they realized that all the large players are going to bulk buy. And I think some of that's going to happen with GPUs too, right? It's all part of scaling the supply chain in order to meet demand. And I think regardless of who the demand's coming from, you have to be able to scale to meet it. And that's what the industry is going through right now. And the supply chain issues, non GPU, have largely abated. We don't hear the huge wait times anymore over like that were going on for months and months for a lot of different things. And so I think that's what we're going to start seeing elsewhere.
Yeah, and the tone from Jensen in his response sort of surprised me, and I guess it makes sense because he's trying to be very diplomatic to his top customers, right? I'm sure the CSP is accounting for over half of the revenue. He has to be very careful what he says in terms of allocation of GPUs. And so this was how he responded. He says that, their CSP customers have a very clear view of NVIDIA's product roadmap and transitions. And so he's kind of saying that the transparency that they have with the CSPs gives them the confidence on which product to place where and when, and to know the timing of these products coming out, and of course, how they're going to allocate these products to the CSPs. And so he reiterated multiple times that they allocate fairly, or at least they do the best they can to allocate fairly and to avoid allocating unnecessary. And I think he was alluding to sort of this, potential for an arbitrage market because of how valuable these GPUs are. You could clearly see that a market could develop where someone would just hoard GPUs, kind of like back in during COVID, right? A lot of people were hoarding generators, right, and hoarding networking switches. To the point where they cause a lot of supply chain issues, and so they don't want to create a situation where certain people are hoarding these GPUs and creating an artificially inflated market for GPUs, and then using some sort of arbitrage to like make margin on top of reselling GPUs.
And that's interesting, right? Whoever thought that this would become so valuable this quickly? I mean, this is even a year ago. I mean, we this started to approach, but things got out of hand in a hurry where this is becoming a serious issue, right? Or a serious consideration.
Yeah, and another thing he said that also made me zone in on this is he said, "Why allocate something when the data center is not ready?" Right? Nothing is more difficult than to have anything sit around. That was his exact words, and that kind of shows you that NVIDIA is becoming a lot smarter in terms of not just saying like, "Who wants to pay me money for my GPUs?" but also let me understand like where these GPUs are actually going. Like, which data centers are you looking to actually deploy these GPUs? And are these data centers actually going to be live and have power supplied to them on time and in the time frame that we're allocating these GPUs? And so, to your point, they're becoming very intentional about GPU allocation, and working very closely with partners and CSPs to make sure that the GPUs are not just sitting in a warehouse somewhere.
Well, and I'm wondering too, does if we're taking that another step further, just to be a little cheeky here, I don't think it'll happen quite this way, but would it be like you can't take delivery of your DGXs until your power timeline coordinates exactly? So maybe
Yeah.
Nvidia will be checking with the utilities. I don't know. That's just a funny thought, but not that it would happen that way. But it's amusing.
Yeah, it's almost like you have to show proof that you've actually secured power from the grid or the utility provider before they
Mm-hmm,
can even
mm-hmm.
share it with you. That's another layer on top of maybe asking like, what is your end customer use, which they're already asking a lot of companies today. And the last part of that I wanted to quote Jensen Huang as well, is that he said that oftentimes they can have a twofer by allocating to a CSP and then bringing the customer to the CSP at the same time. So they're kind of saying like, hey, we're still very friendly with the CSPs. We actually refer customers to the CSPs, similar to how in the data center world, like you have these hyperscale data center operators sort of, getting wholesale agreements from retail colo providers and then referring customers to these retail colo partners. Very, very common model that we've seen play out across the sector. And so it's interesting to see that that's coming out of Nvidia as well.
And why not, right? Because Nvidia is helping to fund a lot of new AI startups too, and their ecosystem goes way deep. And for a lot of these companies, they're oftentimes one of the initial funding partners for a lot of these companies to get started. And so I think that's going to be another part of the ecosystem that's somewhat unexplored yet. Like how are those companies going to grow? How are they going to scale, and who are they going to scale with? And would Nvidia take more of a hand directing that in all cases? We'll find out.
Yeah, and going back to data center revenue that we were talking about earlier, he noticed something interesting, which is that the contribution coming from the automotive vertical. So he singled out three industry verticals that he said had significant adoption of AI by enterprise: is automotive, healthcare, and financial services. And he said the automotive vertical alone, either through cloud or on-prem, they estimate that it exceeded $1 billion last year.
Mm-hmm.
Surprised, not surprised? I mean, given the amount of focus on self-driving cars and all of that.
Well, I think the natural tendency is to think that's always going to be for self-driving. But what if it's for other things? Crash test simulations, emission simulations, any number of things that could be sped up by AI, design work. I mean, I think that self-driving cars part of it is always, a few months away, a few months away, a few years away, what have you. And I think we're still chasing that dream, but that doesn't mean that everything else can't be made easier through AI. And a lot of these things that are very complex as far as the car design, car engineering, why couldn't we use AI? And I think that's much more realistic, and that's going to be increasing as car companies are realizing, oh, okay, how do we scale? We can scale and bring vehicles to market quicker via AI.
Yeah, and that touches that robotic segment as well, because like you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
building cars is a very complex endeavor. If you've been to a car manufacturing facility, there's so many components, so many assembly lines that have to be, is ripe for automation in order to create and be more efficient in producing cars. So I could see that robotics is a tangential segment to benefit from the automotive vertical as well. And then shifting to data center revenue by geography, it's worth noting that the revenue from China decreased to represent only mid-single digit percentage of their data center revenues. And I guess Kevin, you guys, it pretty well in the sense that, and because of the U.S. regulatory restrictions around selling GPUs to Chinese firms, due to national security concerns, they have to abide by these regulations and not sell certain high-end chips to Chinese companies, right?
And it was interesting because I was reading different press reports that said that there have been certain end arounds to that, right? And that this could be hearsay, this could be unconfirmed, what have you, but that AI companies within China are finding ways, either through middlemen or other beneficiaries, to get those chips as they need them. Now, is that going to happen? Is that true? Is that hearsay? There's probably some of each, but I think it would be interesting to see what happens if this lack of demand or this lack of supply going to China creates local competition. I mean, I think there's been some surprises with a number of large Chinese companies that have been able to develop technology that wasn't expected. We've
Mm-hmm.
seen that with Huawei lately and others. Maybe this will create a local champion. We'll find out.
Yeah, and there's one thing, if we know anything about Chinese companies, is they're great at finding loopholes. So I wouldn't be surprised if somehow they were getting access to these GPUs one way or another. And
Absolutely.
another segment that Jensen Huang's always been vocal about is that he really believes that, sovereign AI is going to be a big driver of growth, just because countries are becoming more cognizant and aware of creating their own sovereign AI clouds. And he singled out three countries in his earnings remarks. And the three countries, if you can guess, I mean, they're Japan, Canada, and France were the three countries. And then he said so many other regions, but it's interesting that he noted those three specific countries as drivers of this sovereign AI demand.
And in some of these cases, for data center reasons, some of these places make sense, right? So, Canada, we've long known that Quebec is an interesting place for data center development because there's hydropower that's cheap, it's affordable, and what have you. If you did want to develop AI models, maybe that would make a lot of sense there. Then what happens to that data afterwards? This is where this conversation happens. So I think
Mm-hmm.
certain geographic factors in these countries may lead to AI development. And then it's a decision over what happens after that, according to local governments. I mean, we've seen the EU is chasing, or for lack of a better word, or trying to nail down very specific legislation around AI development. US is starting to as well. And there's any number of data sovereignty laws that are in different methods of chasing the same issue all over the world. So we're going to see what different countries end up doing, and then how does the industry adjust to that? And do we have to localize some of the data? Does that create more data center demand in certain countries because data can't leave?
Mm-hmm.
We're going to find out.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, all valid points, and I mean, that's essentially all of the notable topics and themes that I've dug out from the Nvidia's earnings call. We tried to squeeze it into a 15-minute episode, and I think we succeeded, Kevin. But if you guys like us doing these types of breakdowns, I know we typically have guests on and we interview them, but if you guys like this breakdown, feel free to reach out and give us some feedback, and we may be doing more of these in the future if this is of value. But thank you guys for listening. Kevin, any last words?
Well, speaking of NVIDIA, I will be at GTC next month. Very convenient location. Sounds like convention center, walking distance from where I live, which is fantastic. And hopefully I'll be seeing some of you there. Take care, everyone.